The scene opens at a chicken place called Cacao Chicken, where Li Jian is seen sitting with Texu. Texu, the saint of Sagittarius, calls out to Li Jian to warn him that he was going to die tomorrow. Li Jian the 13th awakened, being unbothered, asks why he wants him to die that badly. He questions if it's because he was eating 2 drumsticks. Texu annoyingly replies that his name was Hugo Otters, not Texu. Li Jian says that he understands why Hugo was worried, but he was not going to die. He states the number of calamities that he had killed was way more than all of the 12 saints combined. He questions if Hugo thinks that he will die. Hugo becomes silent and remembers the Demon Tower, the place where the worst calamity that annihilated humanity lived, that all started on the last day of the 20th century. The calamities appeared out of nowhere and drove humans into a corner with overwhelming power. Just when humans were engulfed in chaos and horror, 12 gods, who called themselves the divine gods, appeared, and they promised humans that they would give them the power to overcome the calamities and that they would select 12 awakened to receive that power. But something unexpected had happened. A 13th awakened had appeared, and that person had not received any blessings from any god. But he was overwhelmingly strong and amazing when compared to the rest of the 12 saints, and that was none other than Li Jian. In the Demon Tower, Hugo thanks Li Jian and says that they were able to conquer the Demon Tower this time because of Li Jian. Li Jian replies, calling him Texu, saying that he doesn't need his lip service. He could just buy Li Jian fried chicken for 5 years. Hugo, boringly, asks if Li Jian wasn't sick of fried chicken and also says he had told Li Jian several times not to call him Texu, as his name was Hugo Otters, to which Li Jian says that he couldn't get used to calling him that. They were interrupted by the other saints gossiping that if they eliminate the Crimson Eye that time round, they would probably receive incredible rewards, and no matter who says what, since that was the worst calamity, they would make sure to get 1,000,000,000. Li Jian interrupts them, saying that they should settle for being able to stay in a 7-star hotel in Hawaii for 10 years, since several countries were on the verge of bankruptcy due to Crimson Eye. One of the saints states that Li Jian needs to get a lot of money in order to make deals with them, only then could Li Jian fix up his face that used to be handsome and his injured body. Li Jian realizes that, when put nicely, they were called saints, but they were actually just thugs who cared about themselves. The saint asks Li Jian not to go running to a site where an incident had occurred immediately just because they called for him. They need the incident to create a certain number of victims so that they would get more reward money. Li Jian dismisses them, saying to just get going. Li Jian realizes they were just disgusting scoundrels, and he decides that once they had defeated the Crimson Eye, Li Jian was going to cut off any connections he had with them. The scene shifts to the battlefield at the Demon Tower, where they were standing in front of the Crimson Eye. The other saints were just shivering in fear from seeing the sight of the Crimson Eye, making Li Jian realize the tremendous pressure of the Crimson Eye just by looking at it. As Crimson Eye screams out, the ground crumbles with fire destroying all the surroundings. Seeing this, all the saints begin to question how they were supposed to fight something like that, and hence they run away to save their lives. Li Jian, being pissed, asks how those guys dare to call themselves saints. Li Jian decides that, in any case, the person who would defeat the Crimson Eye would be he himself. He takes up his sword to dash towards the Crimson Eye, but at the end, he got hit by a sword and fell into a trap. Li Jian couldn't comprehend how much time had passed, what it was like on the outside, or if the flow of time within the tower and outside the tower was different. But at the time, he just had to keep slashing because that place was a special trap that summoned infinite calamities. Li Jian, in the middle of the fight, declares that this won't be enough to kill him. Clenching his fist and his soul filled with the anger for revenge, he declares he would definitely survive all that and tear off the damned heads of those scoundrels. 20 years had passed as Li Jian reaches the administrator who can't believe what is happening. He cries out in fear as it screams if there was anyone else left. The administrator begs him to leave, but Li Jian asks him to scream all he wants as he kills him. As the tower crumbles down, Li Jian asks if he can finally be free to go out. The scene shifts at the entrance of the Demon Tower, where some boys were running to save their lives from the calamities. Jimin asks his friend why he hadn't listened to his warning not to go over there, to which his friend, frightened, says how could he have known that they would meet high-ranked calamities there. Jimin says that they were goners, as the fortune teller had told him that he would meet an unimaginable monster. As they get surrounded by the calamities, Jimin realizes that if Li Jian survived the Demon Tower, a calamity like that wouldn't have been a problem. Suddenly, the gates of the Demon Tower start to open, and a huge explosion occurs, and the whole tower collapses. As the boys start to realize what had happened, the friend calls out to Jimin, saying that there was a human coming out of the collapsed tower. Li Jian walks out of the collapsed tower, extremely angry, saying how dare those scoundrels stab him and push him into the trap. He clenches his fist to declare that they all are going to die. The scene continues as the boys see Li Jian emerging from the debris of the tower and beating the crap out of the calamities. Jimin's friend says he couldn't believe it, Even though those were orange-class calamities that even high-ranked Awakened struggle with, Li Jian was swatting them like bugs. Suddenly, Li Jian jumps in front of the boys, shocking them as they ask why Li Jian was attacking them. Li Jian, surprised to see humans, says that the area is cleaned up now. Jimin whispers to his friend that Li Jian came from the tower, suggesting it was an incredible scoop. Shocked, his friend asks Jimin what kind of place he thinks the tower is for him to believe someone could come out alive. He insists that Li Jian must have just been nearby when the tower collapsed. Suddenly, they notice the boss of the wolves standing behind Li Jian. Panicked, they tell each other to run, but before they can move, the wolf launches an attack. A huge blast occurs, destroying everything in the surroundings. After the dust settles, Jimin and his friend try to comprehend if they're alive, only to be surprised to see Li Jian standing in front of them, protecting them. Angry, Li Jian curses the wolf and defeats it with a single hard punch. Turning to Jimin, Li Jian asks if things are over this time. Analyzing the situation, Li Jian asks the boys to make them shiver. He asks them to buy him some food and clothes. The scene shifts to a fast food restaurant, where Jimin is shocked, and his friend faints down to see that Li Jian ate $10,000 worth of food. Li Jian explains that, since the boys told him they didn't have much money, he held back a bit. Hearing this, Jimin's friend becomes furious and asks what Li Jian means by held back. Li Jian, unfazed, reminds them that they offered to buy him everything as thanks for saving their lives and proceeds to order more food, making Jimin's friend scream. Curious, Jimin asks Li Jian who he really is, a disciple or a divine cadre captain, and what he was doing near the tower. Li Jian casually replies that he just came out of the tower and ended up there. Li Jian brushes it off, asking that he doesn't seem like a normal person, and he can sense magic from him. Jimin's friend interrupts, stating that it's obvious Jimin is a disciple and asking Li Jian if he isn't one too, awakened with the blessings of a god. Li Jian, annoyed, says gods aren't worth a damn and questions why he would serve those beaches. Looking at his reflection in a spoon, Li Jian suddenly gets shocked and screams for a mirror. Upon looking at himself in the mirror, Li Jian is surprised to see that his entire body has fully recovered. He notes that such wounds should have been impossible to heal without risking his strength. Even his left arm, which was previously damaged, is now fine. Inspecting his left arm closely, Li Jian notices a strange snake mark on his palm. Suddenly, the snake mark begins glowing. His left arm glows with the green light, making Li Jian clench his teeth in pain. After that, Li Jian is pulled into another dimension where a giant snake appears before him. The system reveals that Li Jian had defied death, achieved the impossible, and earned incredible power. His existing abilities are being transferred to his new body, while all his achievements in the tower are being converted into experience. The system notifies Li Jian that he has generated zodiac skills and that his unique traits and skills have been evolved, granting him the power of Ophiuchus. Li Jian looks at the giant green snake with glowing red eyes and instinctively reaches out to touch it. As he does, a bright light envelopes him, and he is abruptly brought back to the real world. Jimin approaches, asking if Li Jian is okay. Confused, Li Jian asks if they saw the snake, to which Jimin replies that he saw no such thing. Instead, he describes how Li Jian stripped off his clothes, ran to the mirror, grabbed his own wrist, and screamed. Realizing others can't see the snake, Li Jian grows more puzzled. Suddenly, green screens appear in front of Li Jian, displaying his new status as the Master of Ophiuchus. Li Jian notes that his physical transformation is due to the super regeneration skill. He wonders why the saints never mentioned experiencing anything similar and realizes he can't sense the presence of any divine gods. Regardless, his body has healed, and now Li Jian resolves to kill the saints who abandoned him and slaughter the traitor who stabbed him. The scene shifts to the remains of the collapsed demon tower, where police officers are surveying the site. Two officers gossip about how the impenetrable demon tower has finally collapsed, speculating that the news will throw the world into chaos. One officer wonders if this could be the work of Li Jian's followers or disciples who hated Li Jian. The other dismisses the idea, pointing out that the calamities in the tower were massive, and even high-ranked disciples would have struggled against them. One officer speculates if Li Jian really survived, for which his companion states that he doesn't know, and they'll have to wait for more information. The scene then shifts to the headquarters of an organization, where reporters bombard Yang Wei with questions about the tower's collapse and whether there's any chance Li Jian survived. Yang Wei dismisses them, saying he will not comment on that question. Moving out, in his car afterward, Yang Wei fumes at how often Li Jian's name is brought up. He considers the possibility of Li Jian being alive after spending 20 years in the tower but quickly dismisses it as impossible. He recalls that the tower contained tens of thousands of demonic beasts, all of them black-ranked, and escaping would have been a miracle. Moreover, Li Jian's body had been severely damaged from the recoil of his powers since, unlike the other 12 saints, he wasn't blessed by the gods. Yang Wei mutters that if Li Jian somehow survived, he sighs off thinking that everything would be over. The scene shifts to the airport, where Hugo Otters is being welcomed upon his arrival as one of the 12 saints. As he descends the stairs, he asks a security officer about the Prime Minister's whereabouts. The officer informs him that the Prime Minister is waiting at his residence and that Hugo's vehicle has been prepared. As Hugo departs, the officer comments on how dignified Hugo looks, saying he is the epitome of a true chosen one. While riding in the car, Hugo's phone rang again and again. Irritated to his wits, Hugo curses the reporters, frustrated with their constant conspiracy theories about Li Jian being alive, even though it has already been over 200 years. Annoyed, he throws his vibrating cell phone aside. Lost in thought, Hugo begins to recall the day he told Li Jian about his impending death. He remembers that during the Demon Tower raid, he had stayed outside to deal with the calamities on Jian's request. Hugo had hoped his prophecy was wrong and that Li Jian would return safely. However, the other saints who accompanied Li Jian had abandoned him, returning with only the head of Crimson Eye. Their actions were celebrated as achievements, and they were hailed as heroes alongside Hugo, solidifying their power and authority. Hugo couldn't believe Li Jian was truly dead and had requested multiple searches for him, only for all of them to be denied. He recalls a particular moment when he asked Zhang-Louis Moleng, the cancer saint, for help in searching for Li Jian. Zhang-Louis dismissed the idea, reminding Hugo of the immense calamities that had emerged from the tower and calling the notion of Li Jian's survival absurd. He even suggested that if Hugo cared so much, he should search for Li Jian himself, though that would leave the saints reduced to only 11. Hugo is jolted from his memories by his driver, who informs him of a call from the Prime Minister. Upon answering, Hugo impatiently asks what the matter is. The Prime Minister inquires if Hugo has heard about the tower's collapse. Frustrated, Hugo retorts that if this is another ploy to discuss Li Jian, he's not interested. He firmly states that Li Jian died that day in the tower and insists that the Demon Tower incident was caused by Li Jian's followers. If the Prime Minister is looking to exploit the issue for votes, Hugo refuses to participate. The PM abruptly disagrees, clarifying that he's not talking about that. Instead, he reveals that, according to news from the Korean government, Li Jian's exclusive call line had just rung. Hugo is shocked and demands confirmation, asking if the line truly rang. Realizing the weight of the news, he hurriedly orders his driver to stop the car. Remembering the missed calls on his own phone, Hugo frantically retrieves it and plays a voicemail. As the voicemail plays, Hugo hears Li Jian's voice addressing him as Teksu and promising to find him and kill him. Recognizing Li Jian's voice, Hugo is overcome with shock and panic. He immediately instructs his driver to return to the airport. Meanwhile, the scene shifts back to the restaurant, where Li Jian is smiling at his phone, amused that Hugo has grown up enough to ignore his calls. Jimin, curious, asks Li Jian who he's been calling repeatedly. Li Jian gives a short reply, saying they'll find out soon enough. Intrigued by the phone, Li Jian remarks that it's called a smartphone, marveling at how much the world has changed since 2005 when he entered the tower. Jimin, equally amazed, mentions that Li Jian can now access the internet and watch the news. Curious about his past, Li Jian asks Jimin to search for articles about Li Jian.